The last breath of a dying planet. The air was thick with dust. The once vibrant planet was now a shell of its former self. The atmosphere had slowly turned toxic, killing plants, animals, and people alike. Every breath felt like it could be their last. The skies, once clear and bright, were now a dull gray, filled with ash and smoke. The sun, barely visible, looked like a faint shadow in the sky. For years, the people of this planet had been trying to stop the slow and inevitable death of their home. Scientists, engineers, and leaders worked day and night to find a solution, but nothing worked. Their planet, the only place they had ever known, was dying. Amidst this chaos, one person stood apart. A human engineer, far from home, had been stranded on this planet during a mission years ago. Now, he found himself surrounded by people desperate for hope, for any chance of survival. He had seen the destruction firsthand and felt the weight of the planet's impending doom. He knew that time was running out, but he couldn't just give up. The human engineer had spent years studying the atmosphere, trying to find a way to fix it. He had spent sleepless nights analyzing data and running simulations, but nothing seemed to work. Every time he thought he had found a solution, something went wrong. He was beginning to lose hope, just like everyone else. But then, one night, while studying the data once again, something caught his eye. It was a small detail, something he hadn't noticed before. The atmosphere wasn't completely unstable. There were pockets of breathable air scattered across the planet, places where the atmosphere had not yet fully deteriorated. He couldn't believe it. This small discovery was the spark of hope he had been searching for. If he could find a way to harness these pockets of clean air and spread them across the planet, there might still be a chance to save it. But how? How could he use this knowledge to save everyone? The engineer knew that he couldn't do it alone. He would need help, and he would need to act fast. With the planet slowly dying, every moment counted. He sent out a message to the remaining survivors, gathering them together to present his plan. They were skeptical at first, but desperation had a way of making people listen. The small group of survivors gathered in a hidden underground facility where the air was still breathable. They sat in a circle, eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. The engineer stood before them, ready to explain his plan. "The atmosphere is dying, but there is still hope," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "There are pockets of breathable air on the planet. If we can find a way to harness them, we can save the planet." The group listened in silence. The engineer continued, explaining how they could use technology to find these pockets of clean air and transport them to other parts of the planet. It was a risky plan, and no one knew if it would work, but it was the only option they had left. "We need to find these pockets," the engineer said, "and we need to act fast. We don't have much time." The survivors knew that he was right. The planet was dying. Their only hope now was the engineer's plan. They had to work together to make it happen. As the meeting ended, the survivors left the facility, each person with a heavy heart and a sense of dread. They knew the risks, but they also knew that this was their last chance. The engineer remained behind, staring at the data on his screen. He felt a weight on his shoulders, knowing that the fate of the entire planet rested in his hands. But he refused to give up. Not yet. There was still a chance, a small glimmer of hope. As the night fell, the engineer stood alone in the dimly lit room. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of a dying world. He could hear the distant sounds of the planet's slow collapse, the cracks in the earth growing deeper, the air growing more toxic. It was a race against time. He looked out the window, staring at the gray sky. A thought crossed his mind. Can we really save this world? He didn't have the answer, but as long as there was a chance, he would fight for it. The next morning, the engineer set his plan into motion. He gathered a small team of trusted survivors, each with their own skills, and began the search for the pockets of clean air. The journey would be dangerous, filled with uncertainty, but it was the only path they had left. They left the safety of the underground facility and set out into the barren wasteland. The air was thick and choking, the ground cracked and dry. They moved cautiously, knowing that every step could be their last. The planet was dying. But for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope. And as the engineer led the team, he knew that they had to succeed. There was no other option. But deep inside, he wondered, was it already too late? A glimmer of hope. The days felt longer on this dying world. With each passing hour, the air grew thicker, the skies darker. Every breath seemed like a fragile thread, barely holding on. The planet's future hung by a thread. And still, there was no guarantee that the engineer's plan would work. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, the engineer pushed forward. He had found hope in the strangest of places, a flicker in the data, a glimmer of possibility. But hope was nothing without action, and the pressure weighed heavy on his shoulders. He stood at the edge of the crumbling cliff, looking over the barren landscape. The ground beneath him trembled as if the planet itself was groaning under the burden of its slow death. The engineer clenched his fist, taking in a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They needed to track down these pockets of breathable air scattered across the planet. These were areas where the atmosphere had been left untouched, still capable of sustaining life. If they could harness this clean air and distribute it, the planet might stand a chance. But the task ahead was not easy, and every second counted. The window of opportunity was shrinking and the clock was ticking relentlessly. He turned away from the cliffside and began to gather his team. They had to act fast. There was no time to waste. The survivors, though weary and frightened, were willing to follow the engineer's lead. They had little choice. The toxic atmosphere was growing more deadly by the day. Each breath burned their lungs, and the future seemed uncertain. But the engineer's idea offered a sliver of hope, and in times like these, even the smallest chance was worth everything. The team was diverse, each person chosen for their unique skills. There was Yara, the tough, resourceful scout who had survived the worst the planet had to offer. There was Ryan, the young technician, who had managed to keep the last of the communication systems operational. And then there was Kale, a former soldier who had become the protector of the group. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. The engineer gathered them all in the abandoned lab. The flickering lights cast long shadows across their tired faces. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear of failure creeping in. But there was no time for fear. The engineer took a deep breath and began to explain the next steps. "We need to find these pockets of clean air," he said, his voice steady, but urgent. "Without them, there is no hope. If we can find a way to channel that air and distribute it across the planet, we might have a chance." Kale crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "You're telling us that there are breathable pockets of air out there just waiting to be found? And you think we can just go out there, find them, and somehow save the planet?" The engineer nodded. "Yes. I know it sounds impossible, but it's the only chance we have left. The data is there. We've just never had the resources to track it down before, but now we have to try." Yara leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "And how do we even know these pockets are still intact? The planet's falling apart. The atmosphere's decaying. What if they're already gone?" "We won't know unless we try," the engineer replied. "Every second we waste is another second we lose." Rian, the young technician, hesitated before speaking. "I've been working on the coordinates. I've pinpointed a few locations where the pockets of breathable air might still exist. They're far from here, across the wastelands, and we'll need supplies." The engineer turned to Kyle. "We'll need you to lead the way. You know how dangerous it is out there." Kyle nodded, his eyes hard with determination. "I've been through worse." The tension in the room was palpable. There was a sense of urgency, a shared understanding that this was their last shot. No one spoke as they prepared for the dangerous journey ahead. The weight of their mission settled over them like a heavy blanket. As the team gathered their gear, the engineer looked out the window. The storm clouds were beginning to form again, swirling in the distance. The planet seemed to be growing angrier, more restless with each passing moment. It was as though the world itself was fighting against their efforts. The winds howled, sending sand and debris flying through the air. But there was no turning back now. They set out at dawn, the first rays of light barely breaking through the storm clouds. The wasteland stretched out before them, an endless sea of cracked earth and dust. The air was thick and choking, but there were pockets of fresh, clean air, small islands of hope amidst the decay. It was up to them to find those islands, to save their world from its inevitable end. As they trekked through the harsh landscape, the journey took its toll. The heat was unbearable, and the storms threatened to bury them in the shifting sands. But there was no turning back. The engineers' eyes never wavered from the path ahead. They had no choice but to keep going. The group came to a narrow ravine, the sides steep and jagged. Kyle led the way, his experienced eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Yara moved ahead, carefully navigating the rocky terrain, while Rian kept track of the coordinates on his portable device. But as they neared the ravine's edge, a sudden rumble shook the ground beneath them. The earth cracked open, and without warning, a massive fissure formed right in their path. Panic set in. The ground was unstable, and the gorge beneath them seemed to be widening with each passing second. Kale moved quickly, pulling Rian back from the edge. "Move! Now!" he shouted. They scrambled, racing away from the growing fissure, but the ground continued to shake, threatening to swallow them whole. With their hearts pounding, they realized just how much danger they were in. The world was fighting back. Would they even survive long enough to reach the pockets of breathable air? As the earth trembled beneath them, the engineer knew one thing for sure. They had to keep moving, or they'd all be lost. The race for resources. The tremors from the ground had barely stopped when the group found themselves standing at the edge of the ravine, staring down into the vast chasm that had just split the planet in two. The earth groaned beneath them as if the world itself was protesting their every step. They had been so close to the first resource location. But now, the path ahead seemed impossible. Kale's voice cut through the heavy silence. "We can't stay here. We move now before the next quake hits." There was no time to debate. The engineer quickly nodded, urging the group to follow Kale's lead. They had to keep going, no matter the cost. Their mission was simple but urgent. Find the remaining resources scattered across the wasteland that could help fuel their plan to save the planet. But each step felt heavier than the last. The world seemed to fight back with every move they made. As they pressed forward, the air grew even thicker. The toxic atmosphere seemed to cloud every breath, making it harder to focus. The engineers' thoughts raced. How much longer could they endure this? They had no idea where the next supply cache would be, or whether it would even be intact. The only thing they knew was that time was running out, and the planet was dying faster than they could keep up. The first stop on their journey was an old research station, located deep in a desolate valley. It had once been the hub of scientific progress, where the brightest minds had worked tirelessly to find a solution to the planet's deteriorating atmosphere. Now, it was a hollow shell, a ghost of its former self. The station had long since been abandoned, but it was still rumored to hold critical materials needed for the engineers' plan. The air was suffocating as they approached the station. The building loomed ahead, its walls cracked and weathered, the signs of age and neglect hanging heavily in the air. The once towering structure now seemed fragile, as if it too were fighting to stay standing. "We need to be careful," Yara said, scanning the area. "This place hasn't been touched in years. It could be unstable." Ryan clutched the device that held their coordinates, his eyes darting between the dilapidated building and the screen. "This is it. The supplies should be inside. We just need to find a way in." Kel motioned for them to follow him. "Stay close. We're not the only ones who need these supplies." The words sent a chill down the engineer's spine. They had heard rumors of other survivors. Desperate, dangerous people who would stop at nothing to get what they needed to survive. If they weren't careful, they might find themselves in a deadly confrontation, one that could cost them more than just their resources. The group moved cautiously, stepping over debris and navigating through the wreckage. As they neared the entrance, a low sound echoed through the air, something faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal. The engineer froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Yara nodded, her hand instinctively going to her weapon. "We're not alone." The group immediately dropped into a defensive position, weapons ready. The tension in the air was thick. Was it another group of survivors? Or something worse? The sound grew louder, closer. "Get ready," Kyle muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows. The scraping noise grew into something more sinister. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Then a shadow flickered across the doorway of the station. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the broken windows. "Hold your fire," the engineer ordered. "It might be someone. Who can help?" The figure stepped forward, revealing a lone survivor. But something wasn't right. The man was filthy, his clothes tattered, his face gaunt and hollow. His eyes, wild and desperate, locked onto the group. He was clearly starving, but there was something else, a flicker of madness behind his gaze. "You're here for the supplies, aren't you?" the man croaked, his voice raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in days. The engineer hesitated. "We are, but we don't want any trouble." The man's lips curled into a twisted grin. "Trouble? You don't know the half of it." He stepped closer, swaying on his feet as if struggling to keep his balance. "I've been watching you, you know. I've seen your little group, thinking you can just come in here and take what you want. But you're too late." The engineer's heart sank. It wasn't just the man's appearance that was unsettling. It was the wildness in his eyes. He had clearly been here too long, isolated and driven to madness by the desperation of the dying world. "Listen," the engineer said, trying to stay calm. "We need the supplies to save this planet. We don't want to fight." But the man's laughter was dark, echoing in the empty station. "Save it?" he spat, his voice dripping with bitterness. "It's too late for that. There is no saving this world. It's dead. Just like everything else." He pointed toward the station's entrance. "But I know you won't stop. So if you want the supplies, you'll have to take them from me." Tension in the air was unbearable. The group exchanged glances. This was the moment. They could either fight for the resources or walk away and hope they found another way. Kyle stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "We don't want to fight, but we will if we have to." The man's eyes gleamed, his grin widening. "Then fight if you think you can." Without warning, he lunged at them, a wild, frenzied move, as though he had nothing left to lose. The group reacted instantly, Kale grabbing the man's arm and throwing him to the ground with practiced precision. Yara drew her weapon, pointing it at the man's chest. "Enough! We're taking what we need and you're not stopping us." For a moment, everything stood still. The man's breathing was heavy, his eyes wild with desperation. And then, in a strange turn of fate, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Take it," he muttered, his voice hollow. "It won't matter. Nothing will." With that, the engineer quickly signaled to the group. They gathered the resources, making sure to move quickly and without further confrontation. The man didn't fight them anymore. He simply watched as they packed the supplies. As they made their way back to the entrance, the engineer couldn't shake the eerie feeling that lingered in the air. What if the man was right? What if it really was too late? But there was no time for doubt. They had what they needed, and they had to keep moving. The planet was dying, and with every resource they found, the chance of survival grew a little bit stronger. As they left the station behind, the engineer looked up at the sky, the dust swirling in the air. The future of the world rested on their shoulders, and the race for resources had only just begun. Unseen forces at play. The station was behind them, and the team continued their journey deeper into the wasteland. They had secured what they needed, but the sense of unease that hung over them grew stronger with every step. The air was thick, oppressive, and each movement felt like they were inching closer to an unseen danger, an invisible enemy that was watching, waiting, perhaps even guiding their every move. The sky, which had once seemed a distant worry, now felt more like a force, pressing down on them. The toxic winds blew harshly, carrying with them a sense of doom. Even the engineer, usually so composed, couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the planet's natural decay was at play. It wasn't just the dying atmosphere, not just the crumbling earth beneath their feet. It was something else, something darker. As the group trudged forward, Kyle, the team's protector, kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, his weapon close at hand. Yara was scanning the horizon, ever the scout, while Ryan fiddled with his equipment, constantly trying to find new data on the planet's deteriorating systems. But it was the engineer who noticed something first. A sudden flicker in the air, almost imperceptible like a distortion. The temperature dropped sharply for just a moment, sending a chill through the group. He stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. "Did anyone else feel that?" the engineer asked, his voice low. The others paused, exchanging uneasy glances. Cale furrowed his brow and shifted his weight to his heels. "Feel what?" "It's hard to explain," the engineer replied, his eyes scanning the landscape. "It's as if something shifted. I don't know how else to describe it." Yara looked up at the sky. "It's been like this for hours. This planet feels wrong." Ryan, always more focused on the tech, wasn't as bothered. "We're on the edge of the old city now. It's probably the atmospheric interference. Nothing new, but I'll check the sensors again." Before the engineer could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. A faint hum echoed through the air, growing louder by the second. Then, without warning, a low mechanical whine filled the silence. The earth shook again, but this time, it wasn't just the natural tremors of a dying planet. No, this was something else. The ground cracked wide open, and an enormous metallic structure rose from the fissure. The group scattered, diving for cover as jagged edges of the earth split open. The engineer's mind raced. A structure? In the middle of nowhere? The planet had barely any life left. And yet, this thing had been hidden beneath the surface all along. The metallic behemoth loomed ahead, its surface reflecting the dull light of the dying sun. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. Not a part of the old cities, not anything from the planet's history. Its design was sleek, angular, almost alien in nature. Cale motioned for the group to regroup, and they huddled together, hearts pounding. The air felt colder now, the hum from the structure sending a strange shiver through their bodies. "What is that thing?" Yara whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. The engineer stepped forward, trying to piece together what they were facing. "It's not from this world. But if it's here, it's not a coincidence. We have to get closer. We need answers." Despite the danger, curiosity drove them. Slowly, cautiously, they approached the enormous structure. The closer they got, the more they felt it, something was wrong. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their very bones, and the metallic surface of the structure seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Ryan, always the one to test technology, began fiddling with a small scanning device. "Let's see if we can get some readings," he muttered. The device hummed to life, and Ryan's fingers flew over the controls. The readings came in erratically, the data fluctuating wildly. But there was one thing that stood out. Beneath the surface of the structure, there were signs of advanced energy signatures. Nothing from this planet. Nothing from anything they had ever encountered. Before they could digest this, a deep, booming voice echoed from the center of the structure. It wasn't loud at first, but it grew with each passing second, filling the air with its heavy presence. "Turn back," the voice commanded, chilling and cold. It was mechanical, devoid of emotion. "You are not welcome here." The group froze. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't human, it wasn't even anything they had heard before. A shiver ran down the engineer's spine. They weren't alone. Someone, or something, had been watching them. Yara drew her weapon. "We're not leaving without answers." The engineer held up a hand. "No, we need to stay calm. This isn't just some random structure, it's deliberate. We need to understand what's inside." Cale moved closer, his eyes scanning the structure for any sign of weakness. "I've fought against enemies before, but nothing like this." The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath them shifted once again. A panel on the structure slid open with a sharp hiss, revealing a dark, hollow interior. The voice echoed again, now softer but more insistent. "Enter if you dare. But know this. Once you cross this threshold, there is no turning back." The engineer's mind raced. What could be inside? Who was behind this? Why now, of all times? The voice paused, and in the eerie silence that followed, the engineer felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He glanced at the others, each of them wearing expressions of both fear and determination. There was no turning back now. They had no choice but to enter and face whatever lay within. "We'll go together," the engineer said, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, we face it as a team." They stepped forward, the air growing heavier with each step. As they crossed the threshold of the metallic structure, the temperature dropped sharply, and the ground beneath them hummed with energy. Inside, the walls were smooth and cold, bathed in a dull blue light. The engineer's mind raced. This wasn't just a structure. It was a ship, and it wasn't from this world. Suddenly, the voice spoke once more, this time in a more ominous tone. "You should not have come. You were warned." A door slid open in front of them, revealing a vast chamber filled with strange, glowing machinery. The team hesitated, unsure of what they were about to face. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, but they couldn't. They had to know what this was. What secret the planet had been hiding all along. The engineer stepped forward, eyes locked on the machinery, heart pounding. Whatever this was, it was connected to their survival. And if they didn't uncover the truth now, they might lose everything. The final countdown. The air inside the strange structure was unnervingly still, as if it had been untouched for centuries. Every step the team took echoed in the vast chamber, the hum of the unknown machinery reverberating through their bones. The walls were smooth, metallic, with patterns that seemed to shift like they were alive. Glowing symbols blinked faintly, reacting to their presence as if they were being watched, scrutinized by something far beyond their understanding. The engineer's heart raced in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn back, that this place held more danger than they were prepared for. But he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity, the nagging thought that this structure might hold the key to saving their planet. The future of the world rested on what they found inside. He had to see this through. "This is it," the engineer murmured under his breath. The walls, now lit in faint blue light, seemed to pulse with an almost sentient energy. He stepped forward cautiously, and the others followed. Yara, ever alert, kept her weapon at the ready, scanning the chamber for any signs of movement. "Something's not right," she muttered. "This place feels wrong. It's too quiet." The engineer nodded. "I know, but we need answers. We can't afford to leave now." The team moved deeper into the heart of the structure, passing towering pillars that seemed to hum with energy. At the center of the chamber was an enormous console, a control center of some sort. It was unlike anything the engineer had ever seen, its design too advanced, too complex. This wasn't from their world, or any world they knew. It wasn't even something the planet's inhabitants could have created. Rian, always the tech expert, moved toward the console with wide eyes, pulling out his portable device. "I can't even begin to understand this." He tapped the screen, trying to interface with the machine, but the symbols flickered, shifting with every attempt. The data was unreadable. "This is something we don't understand," Ryan said, frustration in his voice. "It's like it's not even from this universe." Kale stepped forward, looking around the room cautiously. "We should have never come in here. Whoever built this, and they didn't want us to find it." Suddenly, a new voice filled the chamber, sharp and cold. "You should have stayed away." The sound was like a whisper, but it filled every corner of the room, reverberating off the walls. The team froze, hearts racing. The voice wasn't coming from any visible source. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the air like a tangible presence. "Who are you?" the engineer demanded, his voice steady despite the terror creeping into his thoughts. "I am the Watcher," the voice replied. "I have been waiting for you." A chill ran down the engineer's spine. This wasn't just a machine. It was something more, a consciousness and intelligence, something ancient and powerful. "I warned you," the voice continued, "and now there is no turning back." The glowing symbols on the walls flickered faster now, lighting up the entire chamber with an intense blue glow. The floor beneath them rumbled. It was as if the entire structure was awakening, coming to life in response to their intrusion. "What is this place?" Yara whispered, her eyes darting around the chamber. She tightened her grip on her weapon, her nerves on edge. "Why is it here?" "It's a weapon," the voice answered, a hint of cold amusement in its tone. "A weapon designed to protect. And you are not the first to come seeking it." The engineer's mind raced. A weapon? What kind of weapon could be hidden in a place like this on a dying planet? Why hadn't anyone found it before? "What happened to the others?" Kyle demanded, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. "Who else has come here?" "They came," the voice said. "And they tried to use what they didn't understand. And now their civilization is no more." The weight of those words hung in the air, like a shadow that threatened to swallow them all. The voice paused, its tone growing darker. "But you are different. You seek to fix your dying world. You think that you can control what has been hidden for so long." The engineer stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What is it you want from us? What is this weapon?" A low, resonant hum echoed through the room as the walls seemed to come alive, the glowing symbols now vibrating with intensity. The voice spoke again, its tone cold and distant. "I do not want anything, but you will understand soon enough. You are too late. This weapon was never meant for you." As if on cue, the entire structure shook violently. The lights flickered and a deep rumble filled the air. The floor beneath them cracked open, revealing an enormous fissure that seemed to stretch infinitely downward. The engineer's eyes widened. The structure wasn't just waking up, it was activating. "What the hell is going on?" Ryan shouted, grabbing onto a nearby pillar as the ground trembled beneath their feet. The voice, now louder, seemed to laugh, a hollow, chilling sound. "It is too late to turn back. The weapon has already begun." The engineer's mind raced. Whatever this weapon was, it was meant for something much larger than them, and now it was in motion. A deep mechanical thrum filled the air, and the ground continued to quake as if the entire structure was alive, preparing for something catastrophic. "We have to stop this," the engineer shouted, but the words were lost in the chaos that erupted around them. Kale's voice broke through the noise. "What do we do now?" "There's no time," the engineer yelled. "We have to disable the control core before it's too late. Ryan, you're the tech expert. Figure it out." Ryan nodded, rushing forward to the control panel, his hands flying over the interface. But the system seemed to fight him, locking out any attempt to interface with the console. The glowing symbols shifted faster, becoming incomprehensible. "We can't stop it," Ryan cried, panic creeping into his voice. The rumbling intensified. The entire structure was shaking now, as if it were preparing to launch whatever weapon it had been hiding. The team had mere minutes, maybe seconds, to act. "This isn't just a weapon," the engineer muttered, realization dawning. "It's a bomb. A planet-destroying bomb." As the ground beneath them split further open, the engineer turned to face his team. Their mission had changed. It wasn't just about saving the planet anymore. Now it was about preventing the total annihilation of everything. "We have to shut it down or we all die," the engineer said, his voice firm with determination. "We need to reach the core, and we need to do it now." With time slipping away, the group raced toward the heart of the structure, where the energy signature was strongest. The voice continued to echo through the walls, relentless and cold. But the team had one goal: to stop whatever had been set in motion before it was too late. In the distance, the core of the structure began to glow brighter, pulsing like a heart, ready to beat its final rhythm. The countdown had begun. The ultimate sacrifice. The air was suffocating, thick with an unnatural energy that pressed down on the group as they rushed through the twisting corridors of the structure. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the hum of the machinery surrounding them grew louder as though the very walls were alive, breathing in rhythm with their frantic pace. Time was running out. The countdown was nearing its final moments. Every second felt like a lifetime. The engineer's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the urgency of their mission. They had to reach the core, disable the weapon, and prevent the total annihilation of their world. But as they sprinted through the endless maze of metal and light, the weight of the task became overwhelming. The fate of their planet rested on their shoulders, and the pressure was suffocating. "We're almost there," Cale said, his voice strained as he pushed the group forward. He was the first to notice the shifting energy fields ahead. The air itself seemed to crackle with electricity, and the walls of the corridor pulsed with a menacing glow. "Hurry." The engineer nodded, his mind working furiously to process everything they had learned. The voice, the weapon, the bomb. This structure was a relic from a time long past, a weapon meant to protect, but now turned into an unstoppable force of destruction. And now it was about to unleash its power. The voice had been right. They were too late to stop it completely. But if they could deactivate the core in time, they might still have a chance. They reached a large chamber, the heart of the structure, where the core pulsed like a living entity, its energy radiating outward in intense waves. The core itself was massive, a glowing mass of swirling energy surrounded by intricate patterns of metal and light. The entire room seemed to vibrate in tune with the power that emanated from it. "There it is," Ryan said, his voice barely audible over the deafening hum. "This is it, the control core." The engineer stepped forward, feeling the weight of the task before them. But as he approached the core, a wave of realization washed over him. The voice had warned them. They weren't just here to stop the weapon. They were here to face a far greater truth. The core wasn't just a weapon, it was something far more profound, more dangerous. The power it held could destroy worlds, and the only way to stop it was a sacrifice. His sacrifice. "No time," Kyle said, noticing the engineer's hesitation. "We need to act now, or it'll be too late." The engineer's eyes locked onto the core, and everything seemed to fall into place. The sacrifice wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. The core required someone to stay behind, to channel its power and deactivate it from within. The only way to shut it down was to become part of it. The realization hit like a thunderclap. "I have to stay," the engineer said, his voice tight. "I'm the only one who can disable it. The rest of you need to leave now." The words hung in the air, a heavy weight that seemed to freeze the entire group in place. Kyle stepped forward, his expression hard, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew what the engineer meant, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "No," Kyle said firmly. "We're in this together. You're not doing this alone." Yara's eyes widened, disbelief crossing her face. You can't stay here. You'll die. We all will." The engineer's gaze softened. "If I don't do this, the entire planet will die. This is the only way. I can't let that happen. I've seen too much destruction already." The team stood silent, the enormity of the situation crashing down on them. The engineer turned to face the core, his mind fully set. They didn't have time for another plan. This was the only option. "You don't have to do this," Ryan said, his voice cracking. "There has to be another way. We can't lose you," but the engineer knew it was the only choice. He had always known that this moment would come, that there would be a time when the cost of saving the planet would be too high. And now that time had arrived. "I'm sorry," the engineer said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "But this is the only way." The room seemed to grow colder as the core's energy shifted, its hum growing louder, more insistent. The countdown was nearly complete. There was no more time for discussion. Cale's fist clenched, and for a moment the silence between them was filled with unsaid words. Then in a low voice, Cale said, "You're right. We'll never forget. You." The engineer gave him a small, sad smile. "Tell them all that we did what we could, that we didn't give up." Cale nodded, and without another word the team turned and began to leave, heading toward the exit they had come through. The engineer stayed behind, feeling the weight of their departure. His team, his friends. He would never see them again. But this was the only way. As the team left the chamber, the engineer took one last look at the core, then stepped forward. The core's power pulsed around him, its energy swirling and crackling with intensity. His fingers brushed the control panel, and he could feel the heat rising, the pulse of the machine resonating through his body. He took a deep breath and pressed a series of commands into the console. The core began to respond, its hum growing louder, more violent. The countdown was almost over, and the room began to tremble as if the structure itself was fighting to maintain control. The engineer closed his eyes, focusing all of his energy on the task at hand. His body began to glow with the same eerie light that had filled the chamber. The core's energy was flowing into him, and he could feel his own strength waning with each passing second. His body was becoming part of the machine, a conduit for its power. He fought the overwhelming pull of the energy, forcing himself to stay focused on the task. The countdown was down to mere seconds. He could hear his pulse in his ears, the last beats of a heart determined to do the right thing. The world outside, his team, his planet, everything depended on him. As the final seconds ticked away, the engineer took one last breath and whispered to himself, "For them, for the world." And then, with a final surge of energy, he activated the core's shutdown sequence. The room exploded in a blinding flash of light and the world went silent. Outside, as the team reached the surface, the ground rumbled one last time, a final echo of the destruction that had almost been unleashed. The sky above them cleared, the storm clouds dissipating. The planet was still alive, but they would never forget the sacrifice that had saved them all. A new dawn. The dust had barely settled as the team emerged from the depths of the structure. Their footsteps were heavy, their minds reeling from the events that had just transpired. The world they had fought to save was still standing, but the price had been unimaginable. The air was different now, clearer, less oppressive. The toxic winds had receded, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sky seemed to carry a glimmer of hope. They had done it. The planet had been saved, but at what cost? The team moved in silence, each person lost in their thoughts. Kale walked ahead, his hand gripping the hilt of his weapon, his face unreadable. Yara kept close, her expression solemn, the weight of their mission heavy on her heart. Ryan, usually the tech expert with 1,000 thoughts racing in his mind, was silent, staring at the horizon as though searching for something he couldn't quite name. And then there was the engineer, who had stayed behind. The truth of it hit them all at once, like a wave crashing over them. The engineer was gone. Their friend, their leader, had sacrificed everything to save them, to save the planet. They had no words. There was no comfort to be found in the reality of it all. Their survival felt like a hollow victory. As they trekked across the barren landscape heading back toward the underground facility where they had first gathered, Kale's voice broke through the stillness. "We need to get back to the others. We need to let them know." Yara nodded, her eyes distant. "We will, but there's something I don't understand. If the engineer stayed behind, how did we make it out alive?" Ryan looked up, his face pale as the realization dawned on him. The shutdown, it worked, but it must have triggered something, a failsafe. Kyle frowned. "A failsafe?" Ryan nodded, his voice shaky. "Yes. When the engineer activated the core, it didn't just shut it down. It sent a pulse, wave of energy. It wiped out the destructive force of the weapon, but it also released a surge of power, and that power, it saved us. It protected us long enough for us to escape." "But why didn't we feel it?" Yara asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "We were close enough." "It must have been the core itself," Ryan speculated. "It shielded us. The engineer was the catalyst, but we were spared because of it." The thought of it haunted them. The engineer's final act had not only saved the planet, but it had also spared them. They had come so close to losing everything, and now they were left with nothing but the memory of their friend's sacrifice. As the group approached the facility, the doors slid open, and they stepped inside, greeted by the familiar, sterile environment of their temporary refuge. But everything felt different now. The air was lighter, the atmosphere charged with a quiet sense of awe. The planet was alive, breathing again, but there was no joy in their hearts. Just the heavy burden of loss, "We need to find the others," Kyle said, his voice firm but tinged with sorrow. "We need to honor their sacrifice." But before they could move forward, a sound filled the room. A soft hum, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The team froze, their instincts kicking in, their weapons drawn in an instant. The hum intensified, reverberating through the walls of the facility. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. A figure appeared at the entrance. The team's breath caught in their throats. For a moment, they thought their minds were playing tricks on them. But no, standing there, bathed in the soft glow of the facility's emergency lights, was the engineer. They couldn't believe their eyes. The engineer, the one who had stayed behind in the heart of the structure, the one who had sacrificed everything, was standing in front of them, alive. Cale blinked, as though trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But how? The engineer smiled faintly, his face weary but unmistakably present. "You didn't think I'd leave you all behind, did you?" Ryan rushed forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "But you... How is this even possible? The core, The engineer's smile softened, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "The core didn't just take my life. It gave me a second chance. The energy it released wasn't just destructive. It had a restorative effect, too." Yara stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "So, you're alive? But we saw you. We saw what happened." "I never truly died," the engineer explained, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity. "The energy from the core, it changed me. I became part of it, just as I had feared. But in doing so, I was able to undo the damage. The core's power rewrote what happened. It gave me a chance to return." The group stared at him, stunned into silence. The magnitude of what he was saying was incomprehensible. The engineer was no longer the person he had been. He was something else now, something changed by the very force he had faced. The engineer glanced down at his hands, as though assessing the transformation within himself. "I'm not the same as I was before, but I'm still here, and I'm here for all of you." The room fell into a tense silence as the weight of his words sank in. They had saved the planet. They had saved each other. And now, against all odds, the engineer was back, changed, yes, but alive. As the team gathered around him, the weight of their mission began to settle. They had been through hell. They had faced impossible odds and overcome unspeakable challenges. But in the end, they had triumphed. And now, in the quiet aftermath, they could finally begin to rebuild. The planet was no longer dying. The atmosphere was clearing, the air breathable once again. And yet, despite their victory, there was a lingering sense of unease. The engineer's transformation, his return, was a reminder that they were not just survivors of a dying world. They were now participants in something far greater than they could have ever imagined. The power they had unleashed, the force that had nearly destroyed them, had changed the very fabric of their existence. But for now, they would take what they had been given, a chance to rebuild not just their world, but their future. The team looked to the horizon, where the sun began to rise. A new dawn had come for their planet, and for them. And though they had lost so much, they had gained something far more valuable: hope.